Hello, and welcome to The Thin Blue Mind. Each week we will be looking at current policing issues and topics within the UK. Our regular panel consists of Steve Bradshaw, who is a TV and theatre actor, Richard Horton, author, and me, Dave Thomas, broadcaster. What we all have in common is over 80 years of combined police service. Now retired, we will be providing opinion and insights from the unique position of having been there and done it. Steve spent the majority of his service on firearms before being promoted to inspector, where he was a force incident manager. Richard was a career detective before going back into uniform as a response sergeant. Myself, I spent the majority of my service on the roads policing unit before going into CID and child protection. You may not agree with everything we say, but we will make you think. The Thin Blue Mind with Bradshaw, Horton and Thomas. Policing insights and opinion. Well, hello, and welcome to this week's episode of The Thin Blue Mind. Perhaps with recent events in London at the forefront of our minds, this week we're going to be talking about firearms incidents, what they are, what it means, and the post-incident procedures following a fatal shooting, let's say. We're very lucky today to be joined by a guest who I suppose is an expert in his field. Certainly Richard and myself know little or nothing about firearms. Darren, welcome to The Thin Blue Mind. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of a background précis of your own experience.
Okay, I'm Darren. My background is I joined the army straight from school when I was a young 16-year-old. I spent 10 years in the Royal Green Jackets. I left as a corporal with a bit of experience in different operational sides of the world. I was an instructor for 7 years, firearms and tactical instructor in the army. And then I joined the police, joined Lancashire Police, did 24 years in the police and spent 20 years on armed policing, covering the armed response vehicles over sort of East Lancashire and sort of Blackburn Way and across the county later on in the service. My last 8 years, I was a firearms instructor and a firearms tactical advisor at headquarters, working closely with Steve and others. I had some additional roles. I was a close protection officer, I was an operational firearms commander, and I was a post-incident manager, which took up the lead as a post-incident manager in 2016. One of the roles as a PM is something I'm really passionate about, and I really enjoy it. Firearms incidents, we have quite a lot, but thankfully, I know the last couple of podcasts ago, Steve, I think we said there was about 18,000 incidents a year, and out of that, only 4 resulted in a serious or fatal injury. Thankfully, those incidents which involve the death of a person are extremely rare. Perhaps it'd be good just to talk about what is a firearms incident.
Well, basically, if the officer themselves or the officer in charge of them, inspector, chief inspector rank, has reason to suppose that they may be in possession of a firearm or have immediate access to a firearm, or, I think is the most important bit of this, is in possession of another potentially lethal weapon. There are other elements to the criteria for the issue of firearms. The part of it that we need to concentrate on is going to be the fact that either the officer themselves in a spontaneous self-authorisation role or the commanders have reason to suppose that the officers may have to protect themselves or others from someone in possession of a firearm, immediate access to a firearm or other potentially lethal weapon. So the first thing that we need to dispel there, it's not always gun against gun. It's swords, it's edged weapons, it's machetes. I've personally authorised for someone who had something a bit longer than a penknife. And the reason I did that is because they'd stabbed somebody with it and they'd made off and they had other vulnerable factors to them. So the thing to dispel, I think, is the fact that there is a tight chain of command around a firearms incident. So officers, although they carry weaponry on them, you'll see officers deployed and they'll have sidearms in a secure holster, but they won't have the authority to deploy with those weapons until they are given it normally by a person of a higher rank.
And that kind of brings us to the pre-planned operations and then like an initial firearms response, I suppose.
The initial firearms response is, and I kind of gave this scenario a couple of weeks ago, didn't I? Dave Thomas is walking down Friargate in Preston and he has a gun. That would go to the force incident manager or the force duty officer, whichever name you call it, someone of the rank of inspector or chief inspector, an initial tactical firearms commander. They would assess the information, do a national decision-making bin, which is the tool we use for assessing threat and risk, and developing a plan from that. And they would make a decision whether to deploy firearms officers and then give them tactics and give them a briefing and a lot of command and control around it. What people call spontaneous jobs are actually called initial jobs. It's happening now. So it's not just your bank robbery, there's a man or a lady in that car with a gun walking down the street. It's something that's happening right now. Planned job is something that only Tactical Firearms Commander can deal with, which is Chief Inspector and upwards, depending on your force. And that can be, I've got information that Dave Thomas has got a gun in his house, he keeps it under his bed because he is going to use it X, Y, or Z reason. And then we would formulate a plan to come and deal with you tomorrow, day after, later on, in 6 hours' time. So it's a little bit more than the here and now. And what that actually can entail is, by doing a lot of the planning and command and control around what is perceived to be a firearms incident, you can actually negate the firearms element of it. So that example I give you there about Dave Thomas has got a gun, it's under his bed, well, why don't we plan it for when he goes out for his morning walk?
Yeah, don't arrest him in his bed.
Yeah, after he's had 15 pints. By planning a firearms job, sometimes you negate the use of actually deploying firearms officers.
And I suppose what we're saying is, isn't it, that with any operation, whether it be firearms, pursuits, or any sort of policing incident, it's about minimising that risk to the officers and also to the public.
Two elements to that. Minimising the risk to the public is always going to be high, if not the top of the strategy for any firearms operation. On the whole, the public is always a higher priority than the offenders from the investigation, from the cops themselves. So you minimise the risk to the public and you maximise the safety to police officers. And that might seem a very odd difference, to minimise the risk and maximise the safety. But we minimise risk to the public because we don't have control over them and we want to minimise any sort of risk to them. But we know that we will have to put firearms officers into a situation, or normal officers, response officers into a situation, because after all, they're cops and they're there to protect people. So we'll put them into that situation, but we will maximise their safety whilst we do so.
Just getting across, I've not been a participant, but I've listened to some of these initial jobs developing from the sergeant seat, and it can be really, really fast developing. You know, briefings going out almost contemporaneously with it happening, and just the sense of urgency that's about it. You don't necessarily get a lot of time, from my perception, to make that, spin the national decision-making model, to make those decisions, to get strategy and tactics in place. It can be really rapidly developing.
It can, and I think that's where the skill comes from the firearms officers to the tactical advisors, the initial tactical firearms commanders, the operational firearms commanders. They're normally the leaders of the firearms teams on the ground, which normally are sergeant rank. They will all do the same spinning, they will all do the same decision making and kind of know what's coming next, because they'll all be on the same page, hopefully, because somebody like Darren has absolutely drilled it into them, not only training the firearms officers but training the commanders as well. So yeah, there's a lot to do and a lot to do quickly, but you have to wrap it up with a lot of safety and you have to make sure that things are done right. Probably a good point to mention that this is where rank is not really on the table at this point, other than you need to be a certain rank to carry out certain roles and functions. If I was sat in the FIM seat as a ITFC, or if I was planning a job as a TFC, and I was, let's just say, going a little bit off tangent, or I was kind of indecisive about something or other, for example, this is where the tactical advisor is the critical friend. And you need to basically have tactical advisors who will advise and give some strong feedback if necessary, because of that collapsing time frame, to somebody who is 3 ranks above them. And that's why you need some dedicated, strong, credible people in those roles.
I was a TAC advisor for 8 years. I've worked with Steve on many, many jobs, and I've worked with chief inspectors and superintendents. I was a PC, so that is an example of the good sort of 3-person rank difference. And I didn't look at it as, right, my job's a TAC advisor, I stick to a structure, I use the NDM, and I lay loads of cards on the table to the commander, so look, these are your options. I looked at it with a a teamwork approach and looked at it, and I said this to Steve many times, it's more of a discussion. You know, you're the commander, I'm the advisor, you're an inspector, I'm a PC, but at the end of the day, we're trying to achieve an end goal here, to try and resolve a difficult situation. And we'd sit down and we'd have discussions, and it would be simple as, you know, boss, have you thought about this? And then likewise, he'll come to me with other suggestions about what do you think we should do, and we just have that chat.
Because there's a lot of the times in a firearms incident, especially when you're developing tactics, there can be 3 or 4 right answers. And there's a lot of grey and there's a lot of subjective decision making. So I might go for a particular tactic and another FIM or ITFC might go for something very, very close to it, but something different.
Before we move on, I just want to maybe just talk about the training that firearms officers get. Was it realistic?
Well, from my point of view, having, like Darren, been an AFO and worked up through PC and then to the Operational Firearms Commander's role, it was very realistic. And there were times where I would actually rather go out on a live job than go into training and have somebody there with a yellow jacket on and a blue book assessing you. I felt more pressure in the training sometimes than actually going to do the job live. There's nowhere to hide at all. But you knew that if you met that standard, you met a very high standard. Lancashire has a very, very good reputation for its firearms training, especially, it's not just about shooting straight, it's not just about putting a round on a target on the range. It's everything else that comes with it, all the judgment training and all that end-to-end decision-making. That's where you either excel or you fail as a firearms officer, I think.
We try to make training as realistic as possible. I did my initial firearms course in 2001. It was 4 weeks long. 2022 now, and the course is 13 weeks long. Since that period of time, there's just been a massive increase in the amount of extra training and skills and tactics the officers need to be trained in. We try to keep it as realistic as possible. All the scenarios are strictly compiled before we deliver any training, or the packages are approved by a chief firearms instructor to make sure it's all compliant and relevant to the training. So we do a lot of, or the firearms officers do a lot of in-house training at secure venues. We use derelict buildings for the building searches. We use disused road networks for vehicle tactics, and we use open fields and country areas for open area tactics, but they try to do as much as they can in the public roads, but that's managed with risk assessments, and it's only done when it's properly managed with risk assessments and records and stuff like that. So the training is quite demanding and quite challenging. As Steve alluded to, training is probably harder than your operational job because trainers need to ensure that the officers coming through, maintain their competence.
And I'll second that with the authenticity of the actual training, because there's many times we were containing trains at Preston railway station, or we were at some sidings up at Preston docks, and a bit like yourself, we were doing armed vehicle stop on the dual carriageway out to Preston in live traffic, because you train for that realism. And I think that has increased in the last 15 years tenfold, the fact that it's more realistic now. And the venues that they're coming up with, these derelict buildings that just seem to pop up and fall into the laps of firearms trainers to use, are very, very realistic.
The thing that struck me about the rigorousness of the training is, from the outside, is it must be rigorous. Because from my time supervising, I'd sent people that were, or seen people that were exceptional response bobbies, really top of the tree, go to the firearms course and the back. So it properly pass-fail. It's not like everybody that goes there is going to get through. It really isn't. It's a proper rigorous course. It must be, because of the quality of people that don't make it through.
Yeah.
Well, Darren will be able to tell you about how many people start an initial course.
Generally start with maybe 12 or 14 people, and it's not unusual to get 3 or 4 through. Sometimes that number's higher, obviously, and it varies each time, but each course will depend on the sort of calibre and the student they've got coming through.
So when they talk about the cream of the cream, it is actually right, and the amount of training and judgment training they put these students through is immense. This must be the best and worst 13 weeks of their service, I would say.
Yeah, pretty full on. Let's move on. A firearms incident has been declared. Firearms officers have been deployed to that incident, and unfortunately a shooting has taken place where the police have taken the life of another. So as a FIM, first of all, what initial sort of actions would you be thinking of?
There's just something I'd like to mention first, is that pulling of the trigger is the absolute last resort of a firearms officer. And I can't stress that enough. Every single other option has either been tried and failed or is likely to fail if tried in the moment. A lot of training goes in around vulnerability of people, around recognising the fact that people react differently if they're on drugs, drink, within a group, or even if, substance abuse. There's a whole myriad of impact factors that get trained to firearms officers to recognise when you need to give people time and space, when you need to allow them to diffuse and let something wear off, or let them calm down, or let something else happen. So everything is geared towards trying everything else other than pulling the trigger. And that's why...
They're given every chance.
Yeah, that's why the shooting skill of a firearms officer is probably one of the lesser elements of being a firearms officer, if you know what I mean. It's being able to recognise vulnerability and dealing with it and adapting your style, adapting your response. And that's the firearms officers, that's the commanders, that's everybody involved in a firearms incident. So if the firearms officers do end up pulling the trigger and somebody is either killed or seriously injured, it automatically sets a sequence of events in motion. I did my initial firearms course, I think, a year or two before Darren in 2000. Hardest game in the world, mate. Swinging that lantern. And I remember getting an input from a detective superintendent or detective chief superintendent, double-breasted suit, who came in and told us that if we were ever involved in a shooting and you didn't comply, i.e. we would take your clothes off you, all that pace stuff that, is protected when you're arrested. He said, well, if you didn't comply, we'd just arrest you on suspicion of murder and then we'd take it. So you had a very senior rank come into a group of firearms officers.
Even before the circumstances of the incident have come to light, you're on suspicion of.
Said, if we want your clothes and if you don't comply, we'll arrest you on suspicion of murder and then we'll take your clothes off you. And that's how we would force you to comply. Yeah. So that's 2000. So obviously we moved on 22 years, and obviously everything for the better.
Yeah, I mean, just before I bring Darren in, my understanding, I was talking with Harry Tanguy, who I've known for a few years now, did a podcast with him a few years ago, and we were talking about this exact same thing, and following a firearms incident, and I remember him, he was quite vivid in what he was saying. It's like the officers would be split up, invariably they'd be covered in blood because they'd been doing CPR on the victim. Of course they would do that, and then they would be required to do a blood test, and it brings all sorts of issues to hand, and he was even saying, like, what if someone had taken night nurse the night before or something and it shows up in the blood because they were having trouble sleeping or they had a bit of a cold. And there was things like that potentially could have been used against the officers. I think we've moved on from there, and Darren, probably you're the best person to tell us perhaps what happens now.
So just going back to add on to what Steve said in relation to the sort of background to it. So post-incident procedures were instigated and written by the Met Police back in the sort of early 90s. And that followed 2 or 3 high-profile incidents where Met Police flying squad officers had been involved in firearms incidents and shot innocent members of the public through misidentification, but through honestly held belief. They thought they had neutralised that threat in the right way. The only way that incident was investigated was by the old traditional murder manual. So detectives would turn up, either arrest the officers or investigate them and do that stuff what you talked about, like blood samples and separation and seizing phones and interviewing people, on tape and that sort of stuff. And because there was no other way of investigating it. Now, those officers would have probably gone to work and done their job that they're trained to do, acting within the law proportionately, and their honestly held belief was to discharge the gun at that time to deal with whatever they're confronted with. A couple of those incidents were the Stephen Waldorf shooting from the yellow taxi incident in London in the late 80s, I believe. Mistaken identity, who was an OCG member. Another one was the Harry Stanley incident, the guy with the chair leg in a pub. He's got a wooden chair leg in a plastic bag, and he's telling members of the people in the pub that he's going to go, he's got a shotgun, he's going to shoot somebody. So officers get sent to the scene, they locate him in the street, and he turns and raises this plastic bag, and officers engage him because the officers felt and knew from the intelligence information they had was he had a shotgun. It turned out it was a wooden chair leg. And that's the sort of example, officers are going to deal with a threat, what they believe to be a threat, using an honest held belief. So there was a couple of those high-profile cases, and then they decided to introduce and write a policy called post-incident procedures, which is a structured format now governed by law, ECHR, Article 2, right to life stuff, that if someone is killed or seriously injured at the hands of the police, whether it's just police shooting, a fatal pursuit, or any form of police incident, then there has to be a legal investigation. And that's where the post-incident process come in. Because at the end of the day, the officers involved, call them key police witnesses, they've gone to do their job to the best of their ability. They've used proportionate force, decision-making, proportionate actions. But sadly, due to the nature of policing, people are going to die, become seriously injured. So there has to be an investigation structure. And the post-incident process, the PIP, has that. So it's a way of achieving best evidence through massive welfare support in a structured way, in providing accounts, supported by Federation and staff associations, supported by legal support and occupational health and welfare, to make sure that these officers who have done their job, experienced something traumatic, whether they've discharged a gun or been involved in a fatal pursuit or watched somebody die from a rooftop suicidal incident, or simple lower level cases of arresting people, bit of a struggle, there's a broken arm, or and stuff like that. So we have come on massively in the last 25, 30 years, and that post-incident procedures have been adapted, they've been changed accordingly throughout the years. In more recent years, they've been subjected to 3 judicial challenges, all of which have stood the ground, and that process is a very good, structured way of getting those accounts.
So you mentioned there straight away that the officers are doing their job, the officers are responding to a threat that they see in front of them. This process you mentioned about post-incident, obviously there's an obligation when somebody is injured by the state that there is an investigation. Yeah. From people outside of policing looking in, is it the police policing the police? Is it an automatic preconception of they were doing their job, so therefore it's going to be right, we need to go through a set process? Or are we objective and transparent enough to get to the point of saying, well, actually, there might have been an instance where something was not quite as right as it should have been?
Yeah, a very good question. The process is managed by a post-incident manager, and that post-incident manager is in control of it. And he or she has got to ensure that that investigation is open and transparent. They've got to facilitate that investigation and ensure the integrity of it. The investigation has got to be independent from the operation. So we're talking about a police shooting. There's officers and commanders involved. There has to be an investigation, an Article 2 ECHR right to life investigation, which is what the law says. So we've got to identify whether the force used was proportionate and accountability, and make sure that the laws were right. That investigation is carried out independently by either the Professional Standards Department within the police force or the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, which is a government watchdog who oversee police conduct and investigations for serious incidents. The post-incident manager and his or her team will be independent from the investigation, independent from the incident, but fully trained and accredited to do that role. The IOPC will eventually compile a final report over that incident, and that's quite openly published on their website.
So who makes the decision then that the level of force used by the police, whether it is the guy who gets his arm broken in a struggle or somebody who unfortunately gets shot dead, who makes that decision then ultimately that force was reasonable?
So an incident occurs and the IOPC have to decide how that is going to be investigated, and they'll do it one of 3 ways. It'd be an independent investigation by the IOPC, solely by them and their investigators. Yeah. It'll be directed investigation where the Professional Standards Department will investigate, but the IOPC will supervise that with some terms of reference. You know, a set list of, right, you've got to ascertain these facts and this background. Or it could be local investigation, where it's investigated solely by the Professional Standards Department. At the end of the day, they will be the decision makers to ascertain whether that force used was proportionate, reasonable in the circumstances, and it was within law, and there was no other issues with misconduct or discipline.
When you say it's open and transparent, the thing that jumps out at me is there has to be a level of professionalism around this, and a process must be allowed to continue to its conclusion for the sake of the person who's injured, the family of the person who's injured, the officers involved, the police service themselves, and we can't just suddenly start being in a world of conjecture and rumour and the rest of it. But what I'm finding, what I think is a bit of an issue, and I wonder whether you had a solution for this, was with rolling news and with Twitter and social media and the rest of it, that professionalism in gathering the information is quiet. So we can have a period of weeks and weeks and weeks after, quote, an incident where nothing official is coming out. And that void gets filled by
Absolutely.
voices,
Yes.
concerned voices from communities, but uneducated voices, or voices which have a predisposition to a certain idea about what went on.
You're right, Steve. There's this vacuum, isn't there? And vacuums need to be filled. Certainly in the States, where unfortunately, shootings are an everyday occurrence over there. And I don't know if the IOPC, wouldn't it be helpful if they could just put some initial findings out about an investigation? So at least it gives some clarity to what they're doing and why they're doing it. I don't know if that happens at the moment.
No, the IOPC are quite open. They put a lot of stuff on their website. They won't put anything final until the investigation is complete. Richard
and I have worked in a CID background. Some investigations start with a lot of evidence, some investigations start with no evidence. A firearms incident, there's not a lack of evidence, is there? You've got your police witnesses, you've probably got members of the public that have seen what's going on, you've got body cam, you've got the radio comms. Is it an unreasonable thing to say that can they not just put out an initial finding of fact? And I'm not saying apportioning blame, but just these were the facts.
I think that's terribly difficult. Coming from an ethnic background and murder investigation background, I don't think you'd dream of making a press release that went into who you've investigated and what conclusions you were starting to come towards. At the end of it, IOPC or professional standards are making a decision as to whether that use of force was lawful or not. Yeah. That's what it's all boiling down to. Yeah. And anything before that is like runs the risk of prejudicing your inquiry or your results. It's almost impossible to do that.
And we are talking about subjective decision making. So Darren and I could be on this, looking at the same person coming out of the same house. I perceive that threat to be different than Darren. I shoot, he doesn't. It's down to my honestly held belief. It doesn't mean I'm right, Darren's wrong, or vice versa. It just means I perceive that threat differently at that split second.
The point I'm trying to make, and probably more from a police officer's point of view, is that with a firearms investigation, you kind of get that feeling that you're guilty until you're proven innocent.
If somebody is shot and killed by the police, wherever you are in the world, it needs investigating.
Oh, absolutely.
And it needs thoroughly investigating, and the public need confidence, and the leaders and the elected officials of that public need to have confidence in that process.
You can manage some stuff. The Guardian journalist Vikram Dodd was reporting yesterday that the IOPC are looking towards, for the London incident that just happened, allowing the family to see some of the body-worn video and camera footage. Whether that's a tactic of desperation or whether that's something they feel that they have to do, given the furore around that incident. Again, looking back at EFMIT, there'd be occasions when the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer, the Super, would bring the family into the incident room and talk to them about how they, not giving away the farm or whatever, or doing anything to compromise the investigation, but talking to them with some confidence, element of confidence about, well, this is where we are, this is who's working on it, this is what we're doing. And it sort of built some confidence back maybe in a family that thought they were being given a less than stellar deal.
What sort of things are firearms officers going through after a fatal incident?
Everyone will react differently to any form of trauma, and you could say to yourself, right, I will be comfortable shooting somebody, or I might not be as comfortable as I think, or a whole load of emotion. But when it actually comes to shooting somebody, and I've never shot anyone, so I've never experienced this. I've experienced
the guilt must be horrendous.
Other challenging circumstances. It must be. So at the end of the day, the officers are going through a traumatic experience where not only they've discharged a firearm in a public place, but they've potentially taken someone's life. At the end of the day, doing their job, but they will still feel possibly a whole host of emotional feelings. Guilt might be one of them. Who knows? But at the end of the day, they are going through a traumatic incident, having taken someone's life. And this post-incident process is also manages that welfare and support of the officers.
One of the biggest bugbears, I suppose, is sometimes the length of these investigations. It could take. I mean, we were talking, weren't we, a good few weeks ago about rape and the low conviction rates and the time it was taken to get to court. Some of these rape victims 4 or 5 years down the line. But I mean, evidentially, that poor officer 10 years down the line, how can he remember with clarity what happened in granular detail 10 years on? It's impossible.
I'll give another example of an incident which only took place probably about 5 years ago. A fatal police pursuit on a Boxing Day, an afternoon. Driver of a stolen car, pursued by police. The pursuit is abandoned and the car carries on and hits a pedestrian, sadly killing the pedestrian. And the driver doesn't stay at the scene, he flees the scene, abandons the car. 2 or 3 days later gets identified and arrested. And this is Boxing Day, so there's a post-incident process because there's been a death following police contact and a pursuit. So the offending driver he's caused death by dangerous driving, theft of a car, and a whole host of other offences to contribute to that. Gets charged and goes to court, and by the February of that year, he's convicted and sentenced. So you're talking Boxing Day, December the 26th, to February, a space of like 3 months. But the investigation, the post-incident investigation, which was an independent investigation by the IOPC, takes several years to conclude, and that's not uncommon.
I suppose the obvious question is why? Why does it take so long?
Oh, the IOPC, and I've had this discussion with the IOPC, they're not a very large organisation. Nationally, they've got not a great deal of investigators. And they lack, this is what they tell me, they lack an amount of expert witnesses, for them to go to sort of expert witness about police vehicles, expert witnesses about collision investigation, expert witness about policy and stuff like that. So they don't have, they're not like the big organisation of the police with massive investigators from different departments who are trained and experts in their field. They rely on other people, and the challenges they get, I believe, is that they don't always have a lot of expert witnesses that are willing to help them.
That's a real problem in all sorts of homicide investigations. There's certain body parts, for example, after a post-mortem, you might want an expert opinion of, and there's one expert in the country that can do you that opinion. And they've got a list as long as your arm of other people that want that opinion as well.
Yeah,
it can be difficult. I think the other thing you'll get is it's always a decision that's going to be second-guessed, no matter how necessary, proportionate, rational the police officer's decision to fire has been, or the decision to make tactical contact with a vehicle or get involved with a chase. There will be a counter-narrative with all the 20/20 hindsight of ways that could have been resolved in which the person was not injured or did not die. But that's not what happened, is the problem with that. You may wish that's what had happened. You may wish things had developed differently. But there is always, on these cases, the counter-narrative of it could have been done, it might have been done differently, and the person might not have died.
Hindsight. It's a great thing, isn't it? It's the old "why didn't you shoot the gun out of his hand" brigade, isn't it? And people who are not as highly trained as the people actually making these decisions. The point I was going to make was the impact that these investigations are having on officers cannot be underestimated, because really good people who are not risk averse, who are willing to take a level of risk to themselves and to others to enable to keep people safe, are going to be turned off, are going to be, well, why should I bother? If it takes 10 years to investigate something that a pursuit where someone was killed, unfortunately, but was abandoned, and it still takes 10 years, why am I going to put myself in that position?
But it does bring you back to an important point, and Darren, you might be able to answer this. Do officers feel that they're getting the support, perhaps not so much from their own SMT and Chief Inspector Firearms, but those levels above, versus headquarters SMTs?
I have done a lot of education within Lancashire Police since the last 2 years for the non-firearms people. And it's officers on the ground who are dealing with the police in, day out. It's their commanders, their line managers and senior officers. I am very, very confident that the chief officers and the SMTs within Lancashire are very, very aware and very supportive of the post-incident process. And we look at welfare massively in our organisation. Occupational health do an outstanding job. They've got a lot of demand for their department, and they work to the best of their ability to look after the welfare of officers and staff.
I will say that the work, and he won't say it, that Darren has done in Lancashire, I think, is leading the forces of England and Wales. Even to the point, I think the College of Policing are quite interested in the work that you're doing. And having seen what it was, and before I retired, and seen the work that Darren has done tirelessly, it's exceptional the amount of ground that has been covered just in the last 3 years, and the understanding and the knowledge, because it is an information sharing mission in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
And trying to alleviate people's concerns about post-incident. I've conducted debriefs before for pursuits involving standard response drivers or initial pursuit drivers, and I've said, come in, let's have a debrief, and shall I bring the Fed? Because automatically people think they're in the sticky stuff, don't they?
Well, it goes back to what I said, didn't it? Whenever it was in one of the podcasts, mistakes are not seen as a good thing in the police.
You're dealing with a police mindset as well. Who gets investigated? Suspects get investigated. Yeah. And that from your first day in the job.
That's a good point, actually.
You're getting around, we're actually investigating the incident and the circumstances of the incident rather than investigating you specifically as a suspect. But that's the first thought Bobby's had, because who gets investigated? Suspects do.
The only way you're going to actually get people's concerns alleviated is when they go through the process, or they know someone quite close to them going through the process, and they say, actually, I had a positive experience, as much as you possibly can do in a PIM. That's where you're going to get. You're going to get it from the peer level, aren't you? You're going to get that comfort in the process from the peer level.
When you talk about learning and mistakes being a bad thing, one of the big aspects of the post-incident process is to identify individual and organisational learning. And we can be individually, we can think, I'm really good at my job. Organisationally, we're really good at command, we're really good at policies, we're really good at the job. It doesn't matter how 100% an individual feels they are, or the organisation feels they are, there will always be an amount of organisational or individual learning. And the process is adapted to include that as well.
The one thing I wanted to say about that learning, and from what you say about the PIM process, people are reluctant to say, I could have done better there, especially when they're in critical roles. Because they know that, previously, whether rightly or wrongly, previously the perception was that, you put your hand up as a safe, response officer, firearms officer, traffic officer, whatever it might be, commander, and say, you know what, I could have done that a little bit better, or I could have done that quicker, or I could have waited for that, or I'll take some learning from that. Normally you'd take it yourself, wouldn't you? Yeah. And you wouldn't share it, because as soon as you put your hand up and say, I could have done that better, a big load of bricks
Why
fall.
Didn't you?
A big load of bricks fall on you, don't they? And then you're driving a van round Preston, aren't you?
Foot Patrol Darwin.
Yeah.
That old section van in Baker.
So it's cyclic, isn't it? One leads to the other. If people see that actually, we learn and we're positive about re-embedding that learning, and the person who put their hand in the air and said, I could have done that better, actually had a positive outcome. So therefore, I feel confident in doing that. So therefore, we'll get more learning, and it'll just grow from there, won't it?
Well, it's a role that I have a lot of admiration for. I couldn't do it. I don't think, Richard, you could do it. Darren and Steve, you've carried firearms. And thank goodness that there are people around that are willing to do so. Thank you for listening to this podcast. And until the next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. And
goodbye.
Thanks to all the firearms officers out there.
The Thin Blue Mind with Bradshaw, Horton and Thomas. Policing insights and opinion. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us. This podcast is in partnership with Policing TV, the leading policing media channel. So until the next time, on the next podcast, take care.